and thank you, Randy, for helping the text up. And I need to say I don't believe in witches. So whenever I say witches, I really mean women, or in some cases, men. Okay. Anthropologists and historians have now demonstrated that nearly all prehistoric and pre-modern societies around the world have believed in witchcraft and magic, but only in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe and New England did witchcraft beliefs lead to large-scale witch hunts and mass executions of women. Historians had been writing the history of the witch craze and the witch trials for 300 years. Yet, despite the fact that the vast majority of accused witches were women, only in the late 20th century, after a second wave of feminism, have scholars explored the area seriously through the lens of gender. Drawing on some of those recent studies, I'm going to present some of the fears of malefice, that is, evil deeds, and fantasies about accused witches that led to their extreme persecution. And I'm also going to start out by showing some of the roots of the various beliefs that led to the persecution. And I would encourage you to think about any parallels or connections you can see between this time and our own. So first, I'm going to read these three quotes. Exodus 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. That is, thou shalt not allow a witch to live. This is one of the quotes from the Bible that later theologians and churchmen would cite when they put witches to death. Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, which is over much of Central Europe, Western Europe, Northern Europe, around 800, issued a decree that only pagans believe in witchcraft. Those who burn witches will be executed. And this third quote, Gratian Decretum. He was a very important lawyer, and he wrote a document for the Pope on canon law that traced the history of the laws. And as he wrote, as we know, phantoms are phantoms, witchcraft is an illusion. So I just want you to see that from 800 into the 1100s, these are representing learned people, churchmen, and rulers who did not believe in witchcraft, and that was the norm at the time. And I think if I can move this, yes. Well, and then here's one more. Now we're going to move to 1486. So what happens between 1100 and 1486? Here's the first question. And it's why a greater number of witches is found in the fragile feminine sex than among men. The first reason is that they are more gullible. And since the chief aim of the devil is to corrupt faith, therefore he rather goes after them. The second reason is that women are naturally more impressionable. And the third reason is that they have slippery tongues and are unable to conceal from their fellow women those things which by evil arts they know. But the natural reason is that she is more carnal than a man, as is clear from her many carnal abominations. And it should be noted that there was a defect in the formation of the first woman, since she was forced from a bent rib, that is, a rib of the breast, which is bent as it were in a contrary direction to a man. And since through this defect she is an imperfect animal, she always deceives. And this is indicated by the etymology of the word. For femina comes from fe, or faith, and minus, since she is ever weaker to hold and preserve the faith. To conclude, all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which in women is insatiable. All right. And so then I'd like to go to one more picture, and then we'll get into the rest of the talk. So I wanted to show you this graph showing over 1,000 years and give you a little sense about what was happening in the climate during the times that we're going to talk. So if we think Charlemagne would be over here around 800, and around 800, a number of glaciers started to recede, and that started to make life a little easier. And you see the graph is going up, and by the year 1000, it's actually just going beyond what would be sort of the normal ideal, and it's going way up. So what's happening? Well, the one significant thing here is the year 1000, which was the millennium, when many people thought Jesus would return. It didn't happen, but so that's one thing. And then this is called the medieval warm period. And for the first time, a lot of cultures in Northern Europe went beyond subsistence. There was surplus here. So that was a time that we're going to look at. It's also the time of the great cathedral building and the time of the Crusades. And then, let's see, this is right around 1300. The weather takes a bad change and the glaciers start to come back. So all that arable land that they gained starts to be covered again with ice. And we get about 4 decades of cold, rainy weather and years of famine, year after year practically. And of course, this then, 1350, will be the Black Plague, which could easily take over after people have suffered so much. And just a little bit more here. The bulk of our paper will be looking at this period, which just happens to be the peak of the witch craze, the witch panics, 1560 to 1680, 1700. So right in here, the coldest ever. I'm not making any kind of a reductive argument here. I just want you to be aware that there is a climate, and it probably has some effect on the things that were happening. All right. So in the centuries before the witch craze, before the 16th century, how did European people imagine or think of witches? And you know a lot of this already. Witches were both men and women who often dabbled in magic and in the occult. Think of the sorcerer, the shaman, the conjurer, wizards, magicians, herbalists, healers. Peasants, common people, they believed that witches could do both good and evil deeds. They could solve some problems and create others, locate lost items, cure illness, impotence, infertility, or a broken heart. They could make fields more productive or not. In France and Germany, people believed that witches controlled the weather. Witches often lived on the margin of society, literally on the edge of a village. If they were women, they were often nursemaids or midwives or widows, typically old and poor. Some of them were cunning folk, wise women and men who had knowledge of the curative powers of herbs, for example, or they were psychologically astute. They offered their services for a fee in most cases. Now, as modern skeptics, we may not understand how deep and profound these beliefs were in earlier centuries. For one thing, they had explanatory power. Remember, people do not have knowledge of scientific laws. They don't know about medicine, germs, bacteria, any of the things that help us understand our world. But most people did believe that unseen forces were responsible for everyday events, as well as cataclysms like earthquakes and epidemics, and also the really basic things, the weather, birth, death, illness. Everything could be explained by occult hidden powers. And so how could people protect themselves from these unknown forces? Religion was one defense, sacraments, prayers, rituals. They armed people against evil. And the concept of witchcraft also appealed to people who lived in such an unpredictable world. Witchcraft offered a convenient way to explain misfortune. And a spell could perhaps offer protection against evildoers or bad outcomes, thereby lessening one's fears and anxieties. At the very least, it might have a placebo effect. Some women consciously cultivated popular notions of their connection with the supernatural. They performed rituals of love and magic, using herbs, wax figures, or other devices, trying to enhance their reputation as a witch or a wise woman. Imagine that poor, old, vulnerable midwife or healer. She might deliberately foster an image of herself as the one with power to cast spells and place a curse on anyone who tries to hurt or cheat her. That was one way to get people to leave her alone. That stereotype could protect her for many years, and until the witch craze, that was true. Well, I imagine that most of you know something about Salem, the witch trials of 1692, when 20 people were executed. But Salem is only a tiny tip of the iceberg. And now I'm going to take you to some statistics if I can get it to move. Let's see here. Okay, here we are. So what I'd like you to look at are just over on the left under in Europe, so showing you the number of witch trials that scholars have been able to find. You can see 25 trials, 1330, 1375. Next, up to 1408, 85 trials, 1428, 1500, 387. Uh-oh. Between 1560 and 1682, between 100 and 200,000 trials, with between 40 and 60 or more executed. And after 1725, almost none. So that's, historians, you see statistics like that, and you say, you got to say, how did that happen? What were some of the forces? So, it caught my attention. Anyway, if you look, the other thing is the switch. Before 1500, the accused women made 30 to 40% of the accused. After 1500, 70 to 90% of the women accused of witchcraft. And I just brought some statistics from the North American colonies. You can see that that ratio lasts. This would be Salem and a few other trials that happened in Connecticut and the area. So you see 78% women, 86% women. Out of the convicted, 87% were women. Out of the executed, 80%. I believe there were 4 or 5 males. And I should mention that an accused male witch is most often the husband, uncle, brother, or son of an accused female witch. There were obviously some men who were witches on their own, but most who got executed were being executed with someone in their family. Okay, so what are some of the factors that we should look at here. One is the changing, well, oops. One is the heightened religiosity and the gradual decline of tolerance in the late medieval and early modern era. So, and another one we'll look at then is the changing image of the devil. We'll talk about the invention of the printing press, what that might have, impact that might have had on witch trials, the long tradition of misogyny in the West and the criminalization of women, and the changing legal system. If we have time, we'll talk about that. All right. So going back to those early quotes, as the quotes from Charlemagne and Gratian suggest, throughout most of the Middle Ages, clergymen and other elites generally held that people who thought witches fly around on sticks at night were mistaken. Learned men did not believe in witches and other such superstitions. Furthermore, in the early Middle Ages, a relatively pluralistic, more easygoing acceptance of social diversity had usually been the norm. However, over time, outsiders and non-conforming folks came increasingly under verbal and physical attack, especially Jewish people. And so we should think of that time from 1100 to 1700 as a unit where we can watch over time a decline in tolerance that starts with lepers and gradually over time includes Jews, heretics, gay people, Muslims, magicians, and finally witches. So why did intolerance emerge at this point in medieval civilization? And it is right during that prosperous time that I showed you, the medieval warming period. It's puzzled historians for a long time, but Richard Landis's recent work on millennialism offers a compelling argument. He's convinced that the millennium brought many fears and anxieties. Theologians believed in the second coming of Christ, but it kept not happening. First, they thought it will be 1033, or it'll be, no, yeah. Well, anyway, they kept thinking it would happen, but they finally settled on the year 1000. That must be the time. That's what they predicted. That's what they hoped for. But when nothing happened and didn't happen and didn't happen, the clergy became increasingly concerned. They wondered if God was angry with them. Perhaps we and the people are not devout enough. There were infidels living in their towns, villages, and cities. There were many new competing sects and cults with heretical attitudes that were also in their areas. So what could clergymen do to win back God's graces? Well, one of their ideas was to launch the Crusades and take over the Holy Land, or try to drive out the Muslims and Jews from that. So the first crusade begins around 1099, which is, of course, 100 years after the millennium. Another strategy was to try to please God by building great cathedrals all over Europe, many of them to honor the Virgin Mary. Christians hoped that she would intercede with God on their behalf. And what we see with the increase what we see is increased piety and spirituality, and a real strengthening with its religious practice, perhaps because of the cathedrals. And there was enough surplus and prosperity that churchmen and rulers and communities had enough wealth, enough surplus to finance big projects like cathedrals and crusades. So religious practice seemed to take on a heightened sense of immediacy for many people. There was excessive, even obsessive spiritual expression with constant prayers and constant worry about hell and heaven. Artists start doing paintings and sculptures of Christ, a very human-looking figure who's suffering on the cross. And a lot of the people think about what it would be like to suffer eternally in hell. And they saw depictions of Mary looking very maternal and caring and hoping somehow that she can intercede with God on their behalf. But ironically, the upsurge in religious emotion helped end the tradition of pluralism that had characterized the medieval world before the 12th century. Clergy preached against the presence of non-believers and non-conformists in their communities. They wanted the infidels and heretics to be persecuted, and that became a great obsession for the elite and eventually for the common people. For example, after centuries of relative peace, Jewish communities experienced waves of mob violence beginning in the 1090s, about the time of the Crusades. Around 1300, Jews were expelled from both England and France. There was a similar pattern for gay people, widely accepted in 12th century Europe. In the 1300s, gay people were condemned by theologians and penalized in legal codes. In England, for example, 12th century laws did not even mention any gay sexual offenses, but 100 years later, royal laws grouped gay people with arsonists, sorcerers, heretics, and Jews as criminals deserving horrible executions. The decline of tolerance for people of differing beliefs or practices, spiritual as well as sexual, became one of the defining characteristics of late medieval Europe. And while all these things are happening, there's something else occurring in theology. As religiosity increased, along with anxiety, a clearer concept of Satan was also beginning to develop bit by bit. In the Old Testament, the Bible had been a very minor figure. The serpent in the Garden of Eden was just a snake. But over the first 1,000 years of Christianity, Satan gradually became more defined and dangerous, accompanied by demons who roamed the earth. By 1200, the devil appeared more frequently in theological discussions and debates. Clergymen's descriptions created an image that we recognize: the devil as male, a goat or a goat-like human with horns, hooves, and forked tail. By the 14th century, clergy had completed a complete field of demonology, and some churchmen began to focus on actions of demons and the devil in our world. And if you think about a Puritan like Jonathan Edwards, and some of you may know the famous sermon he wrote, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." That's the sense you get, that people are so worried all the time that they're going to hell, that they're sinners, and it's just making them very, very anxious. Some theologians began to worry that perhaps God was not all-powerful, and they took on a Manichaean view of the world, which is that the God and devil are equally powerful, just wrestling it out on earth, which are even more reasons to worry about going to hell if the devil could win. All right. So again, by the 14th century, Christendom has shifted from being a relatively open and tolerant society to being a persecuting one. And here I need to see if I can get to. we are. Oh no, that's here. We got to go back up there, the graph. I think I showed you earlier, but this was the time of the Black Death, because when the weather changed, and then 1347 actually is when it starts to get near Europe, the plague exacerbated all these anxieties and changes. Between a third and a half of the European population is wiped out. So fears of the devil and imagined conspiracies of Jews, Muslims, and beggars and others conspiring with the devil arise. Common people and authorities lash out against their presumed enemies, and the persecuted are accused of spreading diseases, having orgies, cannibalizing children, and conspiring with the devil. Many are arrested, tortured, exiled, or burned at the stake. So now I'd like to move to the printing press and the invention. Around 1450, the development of the printing press allowed for a number of books to be outlined that outlined the existence of demonic witchcraft and described how to eradicate it. Immediately, books on witchcraft appeared the same time as the Gutenberg Bible, testifying, I would say, to a preoccupation with witches and the devil. Countless of these books circulated throughout literate populations in Western Europe, and they both stimulated an interest in witchcraft and offered ways to combat it, heightening anxiety about the state of one's soul. One of the most famous early texts was published in 1486, the Malleus Maleficarum. The Pope, who wanted to spread the news of the danger of the devil and witches, asked two German Dominican monks, Heinrich Kramer, who was also a witch hunter himself, and Jacob Springer, to write a book. The English title is The Witch's Hammer, that destroyeth witches and their heresies as with a two-edged sword. This book does not simply describe witchcraft, but it offered ways of recognizing witches, hunting them down, interrogating them, punishing them. It was sort of an everyman's guide to witches. Let's see here. Okay, it was a very popular book between 1486 and 1521. It went through 14 editions, a bestseller at the time. But there's no evidence that it greatly increased the number of witchcraft persecutions at this time. Around 1521, interest in the book seemed to die down. And what's happening then? Well, it's the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and religious wars are going on. There are all kinds of warring sects, sects. Concentration was on religious heresy. Many heretics were burned at the stake. These were serious wars with torture and burning, and witches were not evidently very important. At least that's what that's how scholars such as Mary Weisner looks at it. But then, surprise, the Malleus Maleficarum is reprinted again. It comes back strong in 1560, 16 new editions between 1576 and 1670. And this time it catches hold in a new way with great consequence. It's a best-selling book again. And thanks to the printing press, this book could travel far and wide, and this time readers were ready to hunt witches. In the 16th century, artists were inspired to produce paintings and sculptures, prints of demons, witches, and devils participating in all kinds of abominable acts. And the printing press also made cheap woodcuts available everywhere for a penny. Let's see if we can find some. Here's one. So that even modest middle class and urban artisans could afford to buy woodcuts and hang them on their cottage walls. Elite groups, lawyers and judges, theologians and other clerics, physicians and philosophers, rulers, wealthy landowners, they were the ones who vigorously asserted. Well, anyway, all right. Well, it asserted that the devil and women were something to worry about. And I'll just show you a few more. So this is, it says wizards dancing with devils. Here is, these are two witches with their familiars. Familiars are the various animals that were their companions and could somehow change into other creatures or even sometimes people. All right, here's a few more here. Witches presenting wax dolls to the devil, which is something like wax dolls could be sort of like voodoo dolls that you might do something to if you wanted to put a spell on someone. Let's see, what else can we see here? I have a few more. Here's another, this one, she's feeding her, these are her familiars, with blood, spoonfuls of blood. All right. So thanks in part to the Malleus Maleficarum and other and other witchcraft books, by the mid-1500s, the charges that were lodged against Jews, gay people, arsonists, and heretics will be leveled at witches, and they will receive similar treatments, punishment, torture, drowning, or burning at the stake. And of course, part of that is because the only way to cut off a witch's power is death, and burning was the best method. So by 1500s, witches are no longer simply common people who dabble in magic to get what they wanted. They're not just folks who are putting spells and misfortunes on some while helping others to undo curses. In the new thinking, witches were people used by the devil to get what he wanted, and that was much more powerful, serious, and scary. And since the devil was always described and portrayed as male, the image of the witch becomes more often female. And over time, especially among religious leaders, magistrates, and other elite, a new stereotype of the witch gets fleshed out. There are fantasies about witches engaged in wild orgies with the devil, flying through the night to attend witches' sabbaths or witches' synagogues. And notice the Jewish overtones here. Witches stealing communion wafers and the blood of unbaptized babies to use in their rituals. And the biggest fear, witches in league with the devil to try to help him overthrow Christianity, God, and the angels. Witches become known as the enemies of God, as the servants of Satan. So let's just look at a few more of these woodcuts. This is the devil and demons sitting at a table having a feast. And these are sort of, I'd say, classic woodcuts. There'd be many, many versions of the same, and we'll see a few more in a few minutes. Now, All right, let's just do a couple more. This is a wizard and a witch and the devil. But here the devils they're all riding broomsticks. And they would be very cheap to buy, and you could have one hanging in your kitchen or your cottage door, window, whatever. Okay. So next I'd like to talk a minute about, well, 2 minutes maybe, about misogyny, because there's just a lot of hostility toward women at this time. And we're going to take it back for a moment to Aristotle. But sexuality itself provided the basis of the connection between women and witchcraft. But Aristotle himself taught that women were defective males. They were weaker and passive, weaker morally and intellectually and physically. Thus, they were more likely to give in to the devil's demands. There was an idea that old women were oversexed, so desperate to fill their wombs and fulfill their lusts that they would even consort with demons and devils. And males also worried about their masculinity. Let's see if I can somehow go up here and find another. Some of you may remember this. And this is from Malleus Maleficarum. And what then is to be thought of those witches who sometimes collect male organs in great numbers, as many as 20 or 30 members together, and put them in a bird's nest, or shut them up in a box where they move by themselves like living members, and they eat oats and corn, as has been seen by many, and is a matter of common report. A certain man tells us that when he had lost his member, he approached a known witch and asked her to restore it to him. She told the afflicted man to climb a certain tree, and that he might take which he liked out of a nest in which there were several members. And when he tried to take a big one, the witch said, "You must not take that one, because it belonged to a parish priest." So men were worried about their masculinity, and this is just one example that scholars have pointed to. The idea that their penises could be stolen, and they were worried about sex in general, sex and sinning. They were feared that if they had too much sexual intercourse would draw brain tissue down the spine and out of the penis, meaning that intercourse itself was a threat to man's reason and health. We know that young men who sometimes desired or lusted after a beautiful young woman would accuse the woman of bewitching them. The men could not face their own responsibility for their desires, and they needed to blame someone else, or they were afraid they would be seen as a sinner. Some scholars were worried about these issues, even Leonardo da Vinci and Francis Bacon. Men were advised to limit their sexual relations for a long life. And these were existential worries. With all the many stories about witches and demons, many men had to worry about being tricked and having sex with female demons. Young men and young ministers would read about demons who could change their shape and appear to be a beautiful young woman called a succubus in order to draw semen out of the human man. Then that beautiful woman would change into a male demon called the incubus, to have intercourse with female witches who then could produce demonic children to populate the earth and follow the devil, not a heavenly God. We can add these fears to other negative views of sexuality. Women cited as the source of sexual temptation, and a general hatred of women expressed throughout the Middle Ages. This obsession between a sexual connection between witches and the devil is something quite new in the history of ideas of witchcraft. The people, peasants, never imagined witches as having sexual relations with the devil. A witch might be accused of malice or spiteful acts, but only once when her case was in the hands of prosecutors or elite officials would it come out that she had some sort of a pact with the devil. It's the people running trials would be, I would say, twisting accusers' words to make it seem much more than a simple spiteful act. Suspects were generally stripped and shaved at trials and searched for a devil's mark, a sign that the devil left on her body during sex. Judges were looking for a wart or a mole, more common on older women, or they would prick her skin with a needle looking for a spot insensitive to pain that was associated with the devil's touch. But there are many other factors as well. Historian Christina Larner has noticed that the 16th century was a period of criminalization of women along several lines. Laws against infanticide were first promulgated in the 16th century. Now, it was very difficult to distinguish a stillbirth from infanticide. There were no statutes about it before the 16th century. But new legal codes required that pregnant women register in the parish office and some months later produce a live child or be prosecuted for infanticide unless she had credible witnesses who could testify to a stillbirth. An attack on prostitution was also new. St. Augustine had said, it's better that brothels exist. They protect good women from rape, but municipalities all over Europe had run their own brothels in the past. The brothel in Bamberg, Germany was actually owned by the local bishop. But in the 16th century, houses of prostitution, usually run by older women, became under attack by town magistrates, and younger women were charged with prostitution and infanticide. In the new law and order regimes of the 16th century, women were named as a prime symbol of disorder and thus had to come under patriarchal control. Women seemed to be becoming less free. Women or widows who had inherited their husbands' businesses were forced out of craft guilds. They should have no voice in guild management. Historian Carol Carlson and many others have shown that economic factors also played a role. Many women accused of witchcraft were widows or unmarried women who had inherited property or were just about to do so. They were viewed as a potential challenge to male economic control in towns where owning property gave one voice and standing in the community. Disorderly women should not have a voice in governing a town. There's also an example of Dora Nipperts in Denmark, who in 1571 was executed for witchcraft, but she was the leader of a group of female traders who refused to stop trading when the town council ordered it. But she was executed as a witch. Now, one last feature I'd like to bring up is the new system, the new legal system that was put in place. One major change was allowed for that encouraged massive witch trials and persecutions were the move from an accusatorial legal procedure to an inquisitional procedure. In the former system, a suspect knew her accusers and the charges against her, and an accuser could in turn be liable for a trial if the charges he or she made against a witch were not proven. You had to be very careful when you made an accusation. Sometimes you could even be punished if you did not prove your case. The new system was modeled after ancient Roman law. Legal authorities brought charges against an accused witch. There was a prosecutor, so a person was more willing to make accusations because it was no risk to them. The prosecutor would handle the case. The law required a confession before an execution, where the accused had to confess before he or she could be executed. That meant that torture would be part of the legal process. It meant intense questioning of suspects. And because many were not willing to confess, torture was very extreme. And of course, one of the requirements in the moment of the panic or witch craze that they were supposed to name all the other people they knew involved in witchcraft, or people whom they'd seen at a witch's sabbath. And that is one way that we get such high numbers, the multiplication of potential witches to prosecute each subject, then each new accused witch going through the same process, naming more.
I hate to be this person, but it is 8:23.
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
That's fine.
I will listen to you all day long. I just wanted to let people know that we will have this recorded, and also reach out to the alum office. I'll put my email in the chat if you want me to connect with you. Yes. Sorry, go ahead. We can go all night, I think.
Well, I'll just show you a few more of these pictures. How about that? And then we can talk. I can stay out. Okay. So here's another woodcut, 1508. It's a compilation of laws, but it's illustrated, and this is showing all the different ways that witches could be punishment. You know, you could take a stake into the eye, cut off a hand. See, there's the axe, and the hand is down on getting ready to be cut. Broken on the wheel, hanging, burning. You can go through all the cutting off an ear. Many tortures here. So that's one I thought we should look at. We went through most of these. There's a male witch. This is a very famous book. It comes from England. Matthew Hopkins was a witch hunter, and these are witches with their familiars. Okay. I did want you to see a couple of these sort of done by really great artists. Hans Walding, The Witch's Sabbath. It has many names. Some call it the Weather Witches because there are other pictures, even like the one we saw of hail, of opening a cauldron or a jar and letting sort of like the weather come out. There are lots of phallic symbols in this. It is a caricature where it's actually 2 blocks, has greater depth. It doesn't compare to the other wood blocks. There's a human skull and some sort of animal skull down here. There's a cat. There are all kinds of pitchforks. There's something like Jewish writing, it's suggesting that there's, again, there's anti-Semitism sort of woven through the discussions of witches. Here's a goat, which could be standing in for the devil, and she's riding backwards, which also the witches do everything in reverse, and again, another phallic symbol right between her legs. And this is a dead chicken here. And so I know there are some little mice and other nasty things. There's a little close-up of the witch. Here's the ducking stool that some of you have probably heard of. You put the witch in the water, does she drown or survive? Here's a Dutch Amsterdam picture of a witch going to be thrown into the fire. This is a really interesting one, and I'll show you details of it. It's description of the and figure of the Sabbat of the witch's Sabbath. Here's the devil. Here's the queen of the Sabbath sitting with him, sort of the devil's queen. Here's his favorite monk. Here are some witches delivering a child to the devil. And sort of in the middle of the thing, we have flying witches. So that's kind of a, interesting thing. We've got musicians up in the corner. I'll show you some of the details. You can see it better. He was the author, Philip Lancre, witch hunter, lawyer, judge, caused the executions of at least 80 people. He was in various trials. Here's again a detail showing the bad angels and demons and witches all. This is right from the middle of that one. Here's the close-up of the sinister queen with snakes. Assembly of witches. Here's a little bit fancier version of the witches and the demons and devils sitting around a table eating hearts of unbaptized babies. Here's the sick women. They were up in the left corner there, just below the musicians. And I think I just assume open up to questions if there are any, or discussion.